Welcome to the PA Books Podcast. PA Books is a production of PCN, the Pennsylvania Cable Network. This program features interviews with authors of books on Pennsylvania people, history, sports, business, nature, and politics. We hope you enjoy this podcast. This week on PA Books, Kenneth Finkel, author of Inside Philadelphia.
Kenneth Finkel, author of Inside Philadelphia. If someone buys this book, what do they get?
They get a lot of stories, and they get a lot of history, and I hope they get a lot of insights. That's why I put that in front of the title. Philadelphia is full of stories. In fact, more than we even can begin to get our arms around, and so, if you had asked someone what's the Philadelphia story in 1975, they would focus on the coming bicentennial. If you ask them, in 1850, what's the Philadelphia story, they would give you a whole different range of responses. And so I decided when I was engaged to write a weekly or 2 or 3 or 4 times a month, depending on what I could get to, blog for the city archives, and that's at phillyhistory.org. And I've been doing that for over 7 years now. I thought, okay, this is a chance for me to actually play out what took place in a meeting about 15 or 20 years ago, where the Visit Philadelphia people, the tourism folks, called a bunch of historians into a room and said, tell us the new narrative. And everyone looked at everyone else and thought, oh, they don't get it. There is no new narrative. And we turned to Morris Vogel, who was then a professor at Temple. He later went on to run the Tenement Museum in New York City. He's recently retired from there, and everyone turned to Morris because he was like the father figure in the room. And he looked at the tourism people and he said, we're not going to have this in 20 minutes or an hour. In fact, we're not going to have a new narrative. We may have it in 20 years. And the tourism people looked at their watches and began to think about their next meeting. The reason is, he said, and I've always agreed, there are meta-narratives. There are smaller chunks of what might be part of a new narrative, but they're out there, they're floating, and what are they? Those many stories. They're about the first general strike in American labor history. Why didn't we hear about that before? In 1835, the coal heavers along the Schuylkill, who were forced to work because it was the practice from dawn till dusk, which is fine in the winter, but in the summer that's from about 5:36 in the morning, 5 in the morning, till about 8 at night or later. They wanted to work a 12-hour day. They thought that was reasonable, and they struck, and they got and other trades joined in, and the newspapers joined in. And even employers, not all of them, but many of them, they won. And it's like, that's a great story. And so the motto, which was scrawled on fences and walls and chalk and used in the parades that they had, the demonstrations, from 6 to 6. That was their goal, to work from 6 a.m. to 6 p.m. That was considered a good thing. So a story like that, I didn't grow up hearing. And I like that. There are dozens and dozens, and I know they're there, and it requires someone to scratch the surface doing the research and tell the story, not partly because it starts out as a blog post, in 700-800 words.
So the phillyhistory.org tapped you to do this as an ongoing
Yeah, I got to say, I've always liked writing in that style. Back when I started my career at the Library Company of Philadelphia, founded by Benjamin Franklin. But when I was there, which was somewhat later, I was asked, I was curator of prints and photographs. And I thought history needs to connect with the present day. And so when, for instance, there was a debate in the 1986 to build a new tower or not, a new Liberty Place, to break the skyline limit, the gentleman's agreement, so-called, William Penn was the tallest point in the skyline. Well, I thought this is a good opportunity to talk about the history of the skyline and why that building was the tallest, and in fact, was there really a gentleman's agreement? Really, there wasn't. Ed Bacon used it, the idea of it, and that was very effective for him at the time. But
So it was never a law?
no, never a law. But gentlemen's agreements are never laws anyway. So they're winks, and usually they're the opportunity for discrimination against any other group, whether they're minorities or foreigners or immigrants, or they had been used. That had been used that way. There was a movie, The Gentleman's Agreement, in the 40s that made the term popular, a novel and a movie. Gregory Peck starred in it. You learn all kinds of little things along the way. And so I wrote an op-ed piece in the Inquirer, and then I liked that. They liked it, and so I wrote another 25 over the next decade. And that was before the internet. When the internet came along, I happened to be at WHYY working in developing cultural programming, and the head of the web services there said, "Why don't you start a blog?" He must have known I had a lot to say. So I did, and at that time it was their first blog called The Sixth Square. It no longer exists. And that was the time when Thomas Eakins' painting, The Gross Clinic, was being sold, and there was a lot of public interest in it. So I thought, okay, let's make a countdown to see if the city, in fact, can raise the $68 million, which they did, to keep the painting. And so every day I found something to say about Thomas Eakins for 45 days. And that got me started, and I liked that journalistic approach, but it's always steeped in history. So when the opportunity came that the Xavia, the company that manages the website, phillyhistory.org, for the city, when they said, we have a blog component with these images, over 130,000 images now are up. They add more all the time, but they're usually without context. So how about you do some research and tell us the context? And that's what I've been doing ever since.
So how often do you have to come up with a new story?
Well, I'm supposed to do somewhere about 36 a year, and so that's about 3 a month. Some months I'll do 4, some months I'll do 2. I'm sort of addicted to it at this point.
You ever draw a blank on coming up with a new topic that you haven't done over and over and over?
I let the pictures lead me in, and because I used to be a curator of prints and photographs at the library company, I have always had this relationship with images where I'll stare at them and I'll say, okay, tell me your story. And they don't. But one of the advantages I have with working with these images is you could go online and see them, but they're only so many pixels wide. I ask for the image and I get a fat TIFF file. So I could zoom in and read the graffiti on the brick walls. I could read the street signs, look at all the expressions on faces. For me, when a file arrives, and I ask for things I'm thinking about working on before I'm certain, I get it to talk to me. I get these images to reveal a little bit of their stories, and then I have to do the rest, which I'm happy to do.
Well, I went to the website, phillyhistory.org, and came across one of your recent ones that says the hoagie is venerable but not as historic as we've been led to believe, and that it was not from Hog Island.
Right. The hoagie is, the state, Wawa claimed the hoagie a number of decades ago. It became the official sandwich of the city, of the state, if not the state. It's really an interesting thing how the word hoagie didn't did get accepted here, but not in many other parts of the country. It's sub or submarine. There are many other names for
Or hero.
this type of sandwich.
Yeah.
Exactly. I thought about it, and I thought I have the license to speculate a little bit, and I thought, wait a minute, the people at Hog Island who ate these sandwiches, call them whatever you want, we don't know exactly what they called them. They weren't likely to call them submarines, I thought. Why? Because submarines, German submarines, were torpedoing the ships they were building. So why would you venerate, an enemy type of weapon of war? Call them something else. And hoagie or hoggy, and the spelling, it was interesting. Now that we have the opportunity to look on the web and see how the spelling changed, they were hoggies first, but this really the change didn't occur until the 1940s. It wasn't a World War I thing at all. They had big sandwiches in World War I, no question about it. What they called them, I don't have any original smoking gun documentation about, so I played with that one a little bit, and I think it's fair to do. After writing 243 of these essays, I'm willing to take a chance every now and then.
I get the feeling I could open this book to any page and just have you start to talk about it. Like you write about, here, we'll take one at random. A century ago, Philadelphia's itinerant icon of patriotism, the Liberty Bell, sprouted a 17-inch hairline crack extending clear across the bell's crown. So the crack doesn't go back to... The thing is full of cracks, and they learned about that when they x-rayed it, which they couldn't always do. It traveled around the country, which is part of the reason it has all these cracks. And there's just other things that you learn when you start digging, like there's a little bit of arsenic in the bell. I mean, if we don't have enough irony in the crack, there's also poison in it. It's like, this stuff is pretty remarkable how facts and narratives sometimes connect and sometimes go apart. The Liberty Bell is and it was given that name by the abolitionists in the 1830s and 40s. They played on the irony of the fact that it's cracked, that it's not perfect. Liberty is not perfect. So they didn't assign Liberty Bell name to it back in 1776?
No, it was just a bell. In fact, it didn't even ring when they signed the Declaration of Independence. It was in the bell tower, but the bell tower at that point was rickety, and they were kind of afraid the tower might collapse. So it wasn't near that. George Lepard, the novelist, wrote a good story, made that into a good story. He was no historian. He was selling his writing. He was very good at that. And so he made that story up about the signing of the Liberty, of the Declaration, and then the young boy runs up the tower and says, "Ring, ring," and the old gentleman sitting on a stool, half asleep, comes alive, and it's the metaphor of the past and the future.
How often do you come across things that are legendary stories that you find out just ain't so?
There's a lot that ain't so out there, and there's so many. I'm trying to think, how often does that happen? I think you turn to any standard history from the 18th century, 19th century, early 20th, mid 20th century, and they're just riddled with flaws, which is why I don't go there. I go to original documents as much as I can. I'm not out there to explode myths, legends, but I just want to know what actually happened, and to do that, it's a matter of piecing together information. It's a puzzle.
Do you focus on one particular period of time, or is it from the founding of the city to now?
I tend to focus on the 19th and 20th century more than other things. Partly, again, it's the images are driving this. So if you look at the images in the city archives, they have some from the 1850s. They don't have lithographs and watercolors from before photography. They tend to have a tremendous amount of photography from, say, the 19 teens to the present day. So I'll focus on that period, but I'll find sometimes an image made 20, 30, or 50, or 100 years after the building that was photographed. And so I'll tell the story. I'll let that be an avenue back to the deep past.
Now, we'll probably jump around a lot on this discussion, but because your book just jumps from subject to subject, but you write about the Penrose Avenue Bridge, and you write about it very lovingly. And some people might not appreciate that as you drive past the refineries, but what is it you like about the Penrose Avenue Bridge or the Platte Bridge?
I thought that was the perfect entrance to the gritty city. You know, now that we have a mascot called Gritty, it's like the word grit has been embedded or re-embedded in our civic imagination. That drive from the airport was this ultimate, honest, chaotic entrance to the city where on the left were oil refineries spewing pollution, on the right what was this machine that's now gone. It's been this company that chewed up massive amounts of old cars, carcasses of cars, and made piles of scrap steel that would be eventually carted off. I felt that we in automobiles on that bridge were threading the needle between the oil refineries and the future of the cars that we're sitting in. So I thought, this is such a honest, unvarnished way to enter the city. I'm sorry it turned into a park-like, there's trees and flowers, and it's like, what do they tell us?
Is that a way to sort of get Philadelphia? Or there is an it that you can get about Philadelphia?
Oh, definitely. And people, that's what people like about this place, that what is it? We all agree it has something. It's different. It's its own place. And the word grit does apply. I don't know how they came to naming that mascot, but I think its success is partly the identification of gritty. That's the story of Rocky, which I write about there, wondering if Rocky is in fact a bit dated. Is that the story of Philadelphia today, or was that the story of Philadelphia in the middle of the 1970s when industrial decline was driving jobs out of the city by the tens of thousands? Unemployment was high. There was a recession. The Rocky underdog narrative isn't necessarily Philadelphia today, or the Philadelphia underdog narrative is contained in such a way that it's not nearly an existential threat like it once felt.
Are you a lifelong Philadelphian?
Sure. I was born on Broad Street. I've worked on Broad Street. I went to school on Broad Street. I was born at Einstein up in the northern division. There no longer is a southern. I went to Central High School, which is a block off Broad Street. I went to Temple University, and my first job at the library company was 1314 Locust, half a block off Broad, and I work at Temple. So I've never been off of Broad Street, right? I grew up in different neighborhoods, Mount Airy, Fairmount. My father is from here. My grandfather was born at 5th and Pine in 1900. I'm not an old Philadelphian and wouldn't want to be. And that's not old, in Philadelphia. To be an old Philadelphian, you need to go back or have people in your family who go back hundreds of years. I'm not that. My ancestors came from Eastern Europe and settled here. For what reason, they never bothered to tell. They just settled here and did their jobs, and so I look at it as my job to figure out where we are and what it means.
What newspaper did your family read you when you were growing up?
Well, the Bulletin, the Inquirer,
both.
I would rarely see the daily news in the house. And I thought it was an exciting thing as a little kid when my father would give me the nickel and say, I'm going to drive past the newspaper guy at Broad and Arch. Just hold the nickel out. He'll put a newspaper in your hand. And I thought, that was exciting. And before I could read, I was holding, the newspaper and looking at the comics, some of which are the same today. So yeah, the papers are essential then and now, and the fact that the Inquirer and Daily News are digitized and word searchable I use the Temple Library, but anyone can get an account at philly.com, and the Philadelphia Tribune is also online. So if I'm looking up something, I can, and of course the Library of Congress has a number of different online resources. So we don't have to go back and read the actual physical papers, which would take days. I can come up with a word that I want to explore, and within a few minutes, I have something on it. So this book wouldn't be possible without the internet.
Do you have a big library at home?
I do, and sometimes I'll sit there and I'll say, I want to take a look for a phrase or a book, and I'll say, I know it's online now, and I know it's on a shelf over there. Which is faster? And sometimes it's faster, I hate to admit this, to look it up online, but I'm surrounded by books. I love them, and I've written a bunch of them. So I'm not about to say we're past all that. We're not. And on my way here, I held a copy of my book again and opened it up and read it, and I thought, this is a good format.
You mentioned Philadelphia's neighborhoods.
Yes.
And how many are there? Is that a matter of some?
Oh, it's a big argument. Depends on how close you are to the border between one and another. Those borders are always being challenged or changed. New names are coming up. Sometimes the names are invented by neighbors, sometimes by realtors. So, I didn't know about Bella Vista. That wasn't a neighborhood that existed when I was growing up around the Italian market, or 9th Street market. There was, back in the early mid-'90s, when I was at the library company, I did a now out-of-print book, two of them, called the Philadelphia Almanac and Citizen's Manual, with help from the William Penn Foundation. It wouldn't have been possible without a grant from them. And this was a compilation of a lot of miscellaneous stuff. I had worked there at that point since '77, so I had been there, and I had files, and my head was full of facts, and I thought, okay, I need a place to just put them down. And that almanac, which was sold really inexpensively and given away to all the schools and libraries, and so that's what where I began to really do that kind of detailed work.
You write a lot about different structures, buildings, bridges, and things like that.
Yes.
You have some favorites? How about bridges? There was one bridge in a park, and I can't put my finger on it right now, that you write about as being breathtakingly beautiful.
Oh, yes. Christopher Morley wrote about that, and that was the Walnut Lane Bridge. He called it poetry in concrete, and he just waxed on about it, and I thought, okay, this is a good bridge, and it's currently being restored. So it's something very much that, and the good thing about that bridge, it connected the Roxborough neighborhood with the Germantown neighborhood. Otherwise, you would have to go down into the Wissahickon Valley and up, and in the pre-automobile years, people just wouldn't do that. So the city was disconnected, even though it was adjacent to one another. Those are two neighborhoods that were defined geographically. Sometimes, neighborhoods it's a random street that's selected to be the border between two. Anyway, Morley loved that bridge, and I thought, if I couldn't find a good picture of it, I could use his essay from about 100 years ago, the picture, and my additional research, which I was able to do by using the web, and I reassembled a slightly larger story than we had known before. It's not a whole book. It's so some people have told me, and I'm not. They use my book as a way on their bedstand as a way to kind of say goodbye to the day, read a story, and then go to sleep. If that's what it is, that's fine by me. I do figure that there'll be a new narrative to Philadelphia eventually, but it's going to be not. It's going to be made up of these parts and others.
What do you mean by a narrative?
The story of Philadelphia can't. I mean, this is a. There are lots of stories that make the narrative. The narrative is something that is an overarching understanding. And what is that? What are the elements of that in Philadelphia? It's certainly things like freedom and opportunity and wealth and struggle and how all this came together are the stories that form the narrative. Some people in decades past would have said the narrative is freedom and American independence. Well, that's more the national narrative based in Philadelphia. I'm much more interested in what the Philadelphian point of view is here.
You mentioned the tenement museum in New York. Did Philadelphia have an era where there were tenements like there were in New York?
It did, but Philadelphia had a level and a rate of home ownership that if you had a job, in a reasonable job, in a factory, nothing fancy, you could afford, in the 1890s, in the 19 teens, you could afford a row house. A bank, a savings and loan would give you a mortgage, and you could be the first one in after generations of people who didn't own their own homes in Philadelphia. You could be a homeowner. That made neighborhood strength and stability, and last for quite a while. And in the after the Civil War, going up all the way through World War I and into the 1920s, there were about 300 miles of row houses built. Philadelphia was totally transformed by this format of construction. It was tedious, block after block, and two-story and sometimes three-story. And Philadelphia was often criticized for being boring and being a city of homes in the negative sense as well as the positive. And there's one historian who called it the quintessential, the row house, quintessential product of the Industrial Revolution. It wouldn't have been possible without industrial jobs and the financial infrastructure to have tens of thousands of new homes. So no, we didn't have tenements like New York. We had a sprawling row house city, which is pretty much what we still have. More people still to this day live in row houses in Philadelphia than any other American city.
You say in here, South Philadelphia's civic temperature, and Philadelphia's by a degree, can be measured by checking in at the triangular intersection at South Street, 23rd Street, and Gray's Ferry Avenue. If you go there, what do you see? Why is that the intersection you focus on?
There was the original city grid, which William Penn and his surveyor Thomas Holme laid out in the 1680s. And from that would be spokes of roads going in all directions. From that point at 23rd and South is Gray's Ferry Avenue goes to the southwest. You could go to the north and you would see Ridge or Germantown. Before these were avenues, they were roads or pikes, and they predated the sprawl of the grid. So that particular intersection has a nice little triangular, call it a square, but it's not, a piazza, they would call it in Italy. And within just the last few years, it's been reclaimed by the community as a civic space. And understanding people have, well, the city government and citizens and philanthropy have understood shared civic space is a real cultural and civic asset. Let's have more of them. And so there's been interest and support. So that formerly forgotten little intersection took on real community value and interest. And I got to say, just at the same time, there's a great deal of gentrification in that part of the city, where there are folks coming into the community wanting that kind of change as well. And the word gentrification comes up in there too. I can go on about
gentrification. Sure.
Okay. The word gentrification was invented only in the 1960s. It's burdened with all kinds of meaning and controversy, and some people think it's good, many people think it's not. I wondered, for the sake of understanding the development of Society Hill, which might be called the first gentrified neighborhood in Philadelphia, when the word started to get used. And Richard Ben Kramer, who was a prize-winning journalist at the Inquirer, used it for the first time on the front page in, I believe it was 1964, and then it started appearing again and again and again to a point where it was the term described for neighborhoods being turned over to new, young, urban professionals, that sort of thing. And I thought, the way we talk about these things needs to be understood, not just what happened.
I want to ask you about the PSFS building, because you write about that, and if you look at it, it just sort of looks like a big square black building. What's so special about that building?
Well, I think if you went to an architecture class in, say, Berlin or London, and you were to name a building in Philadelphia, you would expect people to say Independence Hall. But probably the buildings that they would name are the PSFS building and the Vanna Venturi house, Robert Venturi's house for his mother, in Chestnut Hill. Why? The history of architecture has embraced certain buildings and not others. And so the PSFS building was known, Philadelphia Savings Fund Society, no longer exists as a bank.
Still has the letters up on
the letters are there, and they're going to keep them. It's a National Historic Landmark. There were times when it was suggested the lights would be turned off. The public rebelled, even though it doesn't stand for anything that we can use at this point. It's not an advertisement. Many corporations have their logos and their names on their buildings, but PSFS is totally, ironically, meaningless at this point. The building was the first international style building in America, skyscraper. And it was planned right at the beginning of the Great Depression. The bank was led by enlightened people who said, let's do it anyway. Even though their assets were falling, they went ahead and built this, so imagine it as the first skyscraper.
I want to read what you say about it. You have a picture of construction of the building in 1931. You say, no matter that New York's Empire State Building, which opened in 1931, was more than 2.5 times taller than Philadelphia's PSFS building, the Quaker City's skyscraper was many times more modern.
Yes. Well, it had all kinds of things that people would come to take for granted. It had air conditioning. It was the first of that type. It was constructed of different parts that would be, so there was the slab, which was for offices, and the service tower, which was for the elevators, the plumbing, and all of that. It had a separate, very large and steel structure banking hall that was above the street level commercial properties. It was so well thought through, and it was form follows function, a modernist concept. You could look at it, and it made sense in how it was used, how it projected its intention. It was a building that Philadelphians came to love, but also people from around the world, and so that's one of the reasons why it remains to this day, although it's a hotel, not a bank, but people are very fond of it. And over the years, people have wondered what that PSFS can stand for, and of course we don't have one solution, but I like to think Philadelphians savor fried scrapple works.
Have you written about scrapple?
Oh yeah, I love scrapple as a metaphor, not necessarily as a food. I've eaten it and I will eat it, but back in the 1980s, late 1980s, the Library Company and the Historical Society did an exhibition on food history. And I got a friend who was a chef at the time, he's now head of Philabundance in Philadelphia, Glenn Bergman, to do a demonstration about scrapple. And I suggested that we could tell the story of it. It's deep history, far deeper than the hoagie, far deeper than the steak sandwich. And it's real. It goes back to the 17th century. It's the original Philadelphia food, you might call it, and it doesn't exist everywhere. And it is made up of scraps. It's got that grit, right, that it's built into it. And I thought, let's change the name, just jokingly, tongue-in-cheek, to Philadelphia Pâté. And of course that didn't catch on. I didn't intend for it to catch on. But it's not a culinary cul-de-sac. It's its own historical food item, and it speaks to who we are to this day. So yeah, I think Scrapple is a great metaphor for the city.
Now, you mentioned the two buildings that they study in architecture school. There's the PSF's building and the Venturi House.
Yeah, so Robert Venturi, who passed away recently, was given the opportunity by his mother, who was then a widow, to design a house, and he made it more of a manifesto than a house, although it is a house. And it's up in Chestnut Hill, and it is contrary to traditional design in that neighborhood, but pretty much every other neighborhood. It's been credited as the first postmodern design in architecture. And so people come from all over the world who study architecture and architectural history, and they will go and take a look at it. There are sometimes tours. It's privately owned, but people will walk up to it, and the owner tends to be pretty friendly, I happen to know. And it's just a wonderful, iconic expression of contrariness, of independence. Venturi, his father was a fruit vendor, of a distributor on South Street. He came from working class roots, and he was not about to embrace the traditional design values in Chestnut Hill. He was coming up with his own values.
Do you have other favorite buildings?
Sure. Some of them don't exist anymore. One of my favorites has been really meaningful to me is Eastern State Penitentiary. And that's, one of the more massive and historic buildings, but that was where I got to be involved with its, at a critical moment when it was about to be turned over to developers in the mid-1980s, it was 87, 88. I got to be part of a group that convinced then Mayor Wilson Goode to hold off on turning it over to developers. And so Eastern State was pulled out of the stream of development, studied for a bit, and then now it's a historic site with a great deal of tourism and interpretation. And we look right now at issues like mass incarceration. And they have partly embraced the mission of understanding and interpreting mass incarceration as part of what they do. It's not just the Halloween tours, which is how they make money. It's how they kind of sustain themselves. But the idea of a historic site tackling a difficult subject that is relevant to the present day, and a building that's 11 acres occupying that footprint in the city, I see that as a win for history and a win for the community.
What's interesting there? I mean, why would you go to tour a prison that's been closed down for a long time?
Sure. Well, and a lot of people at the time, we were talking about preserving it, not tearing it down, not turning it into a supermarket and condos, which is what the plan was. A lot of people said it's a monument to inhumanity. Why would you preserve it? But and I'm part of a growing group of people who believe history and historic buildings shouldn't be celebrations. They should be telling the truth. It's okay to celebrate. It's wonderful to celebrate. But we also need buildings to help us remember the downside, the unhappy moments, and the fact the tenement museum is an example of that. People a generation or two ago would say, "Why would you preserve a tenement? Why would you tell the story? Let's just forget that and move on, and live our lives." Well, it's really important to tell the story of how there was this flawed incarceration system, that how the notion of penitence, not just punishing prisoners, but reforming them, as flawed as it turned out to be. They believed at Eastern State that solitary confinement was a good thing. Solitary confinement with counseling, not like we would have it today, with plumbing and water, which is more than prisons had at the time. So it was a very expensive experiment that failed. But it's worth, and people who go and see it in its semi-ruined, stabilized, ruined state, they tend to be pretty impressed. They've never seen anything quite like it, or quite like it on that scale of cell blocks every which way.
You mentioned buildings that are your favorites that aren't there anymore. You write about Music Fund Hall. Mm-hmm. Why is that, since it's not there anymore, why does it make it into your book?
Well, it is there. It's been turned into condos. Doesn't look anything like the original building, but it was one of the many venues for performances. And it was the site of political conventions in the 1850s. But I like it, and I tell the story of how the Hutchinson family singers came there in the 1840s, and they were singing anti-slavery songs. Now, you'd figure in a city like Philadelphia, that would be cool, singing songs against slavery. But they were singing them to interracial audiences, which was considered unheard of in Philadelphia at the time. And there had been riots within the last decade. There had been riots every year pretty much. And so there was this fear that this might lead to more civil disorder. And so the mayor of the city told the Hutchinson family singers they could not perform there if they were going to do it in front of interracial audiences. And they said, okay, we're not going to perform here anymore. And so we don't hear these stories because they're embarrassing. Embarrassing that Philadelphia was not of a mind about slavery. I mean, this is the birthplace of freedom. But there were many ties Philadelphians had in the 1830s, 40s, 50s to the American South. And we weren't nearly as enlightened a place, not the entire city, as people would be led to believe.
You also mentioned that Charles Dickens spoke there.
Yes, right. And he came to Philadelphia In the 1840s, he went to Eastern State Penitentiary and had a very definite opinion about that. He looked at the facade of the Second Bank, which had gone bankrupt, and talked about that. He's a great commentator about and we have his words and we have Walt Whitman's words later in the century. It's like, I think it's a wonderful thing to be able to turn back to those texts and use them in to help us deepen our understanding of what the city was like and what those buildings were and what they meant.
There is another building you write about, the Merchants Exchange building, and you talk about the architecture of it. But one of the things you say in there I have to ask about is long before 1837, when Samuel Morse patented his telegraph, Europeans and Americans had an optical telegraphs capable of quickly transmitting coded messages over great distances, and the Merchants Exchange building was a hub of that. What is an optical telegraph?
Basically, that if you wanted to connect Philadelphia and New York before there were wires, in ways that are faster than a horse might, a guy on a horseback might take, and of course you have to cross several rivers along the way. Imagine having a series of towers where visually there could be code transmitted visually from one spot to another and this was tried and attempted successfully in Europe to connect sites that were far away, and it was done in this area. But you know what happened? This was predated the telegraph. Well, as soon as you had wires and the telegraph, that kind of made the optical connections obsolete. But we had it here, and that tower, which is at Walnut around 2nd Street, was far higher. Was about the same height of a church tower, and so there was nothing visually blocking the way. And so they could make it, and did make it, part of a connector to New York City and other places.
How often do you come across a person or a moment in history that you think, oh, I really wish I could have met that person, wish I could have seen that event take place?
I feel like I have the privilege of time travel because I do research. And what I find is, as much as I fall in love with the idea of seeing one moment and witnessing that, or being there when something was decided, this may make me sound promiscuous in a historical way. I like the one I'm working on now, whatever that may be, because I've just brought it to life. I've just animated it by doing my research. And by doing that, it's like, I want to see it actually as it occurred, because sometimes historians get it wrong. And we speculate, as I said way back at the beginning of this interview, sometimes it's okay to speculate, but being able to migrate from one historical moment to another and capture what actually was said, what actually happened, that's what I want to do, be able to do. So I can't easily pick one over the others, but.
Are times in your research you come across two different accounts of the same thing that conflict with each other?
Yeah, and that's a good thing, because there should be. I mean, reality is interpreted differently, but people could be in the same room and have different interpretations of it. So I look at that as a way to interpolate what actually took place. It requires critical reading of both accounts. If they're somewhat divergent, that's good. If they're wildly divergent, then we need more information. We can't base a narrative or a story on either one. So it's a tough one.
We will obviously not have enough time to touch on all the different interesting stories, but here's just jumping from one to another. You write, in 1910, America had an ice addiction. It started at 6th and Market Street in the 1780s at the President's House, 18-foot deep stone-lined octagonal ice pit that supplied the elite with pristine river ice all year round. What
Great.
did you find out about that?
Well, actually, they did a little bit of archaeology before they built the Liberty Bell Pavilion, and they found remnants of that. And so I learned about that, I don't know, maybe it was 20 years ago or so, and it turned out that the Washingtons had it when George Washington was president. Jefferson liked it. He, I believe, replicated it in Virginia. And so the fact that it was this massive ice pit below grade, that frozen Schuylkill or Delaware River water could be brought in and it would last through the entire summer, and that everyone knew that this was the way you kept your food chilled. Well, not necessarily at a safe low temperature, but safe enough that the ice boxes of America by the late 19th and early 20th century, everyone had the blocks of ice being delivered on sometimes a daily basis, or at least several times a week. And then at the Sesquicentennial Exhibition in 1926, when finally there was an electric ice box that prevented you from having to buy a massive cube of ice and having a guy traipsing through your house with this, or going in the back door, but dripping and bringing in debris from his boots from the street, and also, of course, there were all these rumors that would be about the Iceman and the wives of the neighborhood. So the final delivery was an ice box itself. And there was a statue at the Sesquicentennial Exhibition of an Iceman bringing in the electric device that was going to be plugged in. That would be the last time you saw him. And ice was this incredible addiction until the improvement, which we pretty much still live with as is today.
Now, you write in your book quite a bit about the building of the Benjamin Franklin Parkway. Now, when did that start? Whose idea was it?
Connecting the center of the city to the park. I mean, the park is great, but unless you could see it or feel it, being at the very center where City Hall is. So they had this notion in the early 1870s, while City Hall was still very much at the early stages of construction. But they said, let's do a way to the parkway. But it wasn't going to be a visual diagonal. That idea came up in the 1880s. It took quite a while and many different variations of this until the 1918 plan by Jacques Ribert. And there were all these celebrations of its 100th anniversary recently. So the idea of doing this was basically to build a quadrant of the city and then gut it, because they had just finished building this section of the city. Buildings were being demolished by the 100 that had just been built 30 years before.
Was it controversial? Was there a lot of opposition to it?
Oh, and you could imagine there were ways of making money if you knew who and you knew what and that sort of thing, or the contractors for the roads that were put through, or the future sites that were speculated on, and all kinds of things. Yeah, it was very controversial, and eventually every cultural institution that was on Broad Street or anywhere else in the city was being coaxed to move out. So it was a risky and transformative project.
You write about the Museum Mile. It was an ambitious idea that reflected a two-dimensional vision, considering that museums alone, no matter how well-stocked or how well-appointed, do not a great city make. And you quote Witold Rybczynski saying, "No one spends 2 hours in a museum, then goes down the street to spend 2 hours in another museum."
Right.
So is it a success?
Well, they've come to realize it takes more than a museum and another museum and a third museum to make it a success. There are cafes, there are public spaces, there are playgrounds, there are any number of other things to do, because people, as much as they want to think of themselves as good cultural consumers, there's only so much that's reasonable in a day. So the idea of a museum mile is a marketing, and it's been effective as a marketing concept, but in fact, a civic boulevard has to be, civic is not just a museum. Civic is many things.
Are people still discussing what to do with it? I mean, are they changing it in any ways, or is
Well,
it
there
what
are,
it was intended to be?
Yeah, at this point there are a few open sites that haven't yet been decided upon. There was a plan that fell through a while back for a Calder museum. Do we need yet another museum, or do we need a cafe or a public art project or whatever it may be? And there's still discussions. The Parkway, like any other civic space, is a living, breathing, ongoing project. It's never complete, and that makes everyone, literally everyone, a participant or potential participant in it. And when people are participants, they're not looking at history as a spectator sport. History really isn't. If it's done right, it's talking about who we are and why we're here.
For someone who has never seen the clothespin, is it worth going to see, and what's so special about it?
Well, Claes Oldenburg, the sculptor, came up with this idea of a 45-foot tall clothespin, which is across from City Hall. And yeah, it's worth seeing. It's from the mid-1970s. It was a radical, edgy idea. But I think we've seen and gotten used to public art being many different things for many different people. And so it's not as revolutionary all these decades later as it was then. But Oldenburg, he even wanted to push the envelope a little harder. He had the notion of a 45-foot tall screw, which the metaphor for that just didn't sit well with the city fathers, and so he toned it down by making a clothespin, which you say, why a clothespin? It's a symbol, some say, of domesticity, of a clothesline. Of course, who uses them anymore when you have clothes dryers? But that would be the entrance to the subway, which is the way home. Or it looks like an embrace, a couple holding one another, or it looks like the spring looks like a 76, which is when it was installed. The artist smartly says, I don't need to speak for it. The art speaks for itself, which gets everyone involved.
Unfortunately, we're out of time. We've been speaking with Kenneth Finkel. He writes for phillyhistory.org and is also the author of this book, Insight Philadelphia. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
You've been listening to a podcast of PA Books, a production of PCN, the Pennsylvania Cable Network. Full episodes of PA Books, as well as other PCN programs, are available to stream with the PCN app. Visit PCNTV.com or the App Store for details. Like us on Facebook.